Hello and welcome to the Federal. UN climate summits are held every year for governments to agree steps to limit global temperature rises. These summits are the COPs, which means Conference of the Parties. Parties here refers to the countries that signed up to the original UN climate agreement in 1992. So the 27th annual UN meeting on climate is happening now in Egypt. I have Nithin Sethi with me to discuss about COP27. Nithin Sethi is an award-winning journalist and a member of Reporters Collective. He has investigated and reported for 2 decades on several issues, including India's political economy, natural resources, environment, climate change, and development. Thank you for joining me, Nithin. To start with, what will COP27 focus on?
So I think, as you rightly said, this is a 27th meeting of more than 190 countries trying to pull together what should be done going ahead on climate change. Critically, in 2015, all the countries signed up to something called the Paris Agreement, which one can think of as a global law for all countries to work together. And since then, all countries have been trying to create a set of rules which will help implement that law. What most developing countries have seen since then is that the commitments that were made in 2015 are yet to come through. The fruits of that hard negotiation are difficult for poorer countries to notice, particularly on 2 or 3 counts, where one, the rich nations were supposed to provide funds for the poorer countries to do better on climate change, to adapt and to prevent further losses. 2, they were supposed to, rich countries were supposed to deliver technologies to poorer countries so that we don't go down the same path that rich countries had. But on several of these counts, particularly finance, we've seen the rich countries not delivering and giving several excuses over last year. To give you a specific example, there was a commitment from so-called developed nations or rich countries to provide annually $100 billion for a decade annually. And last year, they admitted they haven't been able to do so. They then recommitted that we'll do it in the next couple of years. And this year, again, we've seen a lapse on that count. So this year, because it's being held in Egypt, which is a developing country itself, and the host, they are in some sense the presidency now, COP27 has become about implementing existing commitments rather than saying, let's find new ones, because it's easy to make new commitments, as we are finding, and difficult to live up to the earlier ones. And there's been a repeated failure. 2, there's been an attempt post 2015 to rewrite the Paris Agreement through its rules. We've seen this in Indian circumstance also, that sometimes the rules of a law are written to subvert the law itself. And that attempt's been made by many developed countries ever since. This particular COP also attempts to try and stop that and say, let's first deliver what we're committed to. 1, on finance again, 2, on what's called the loss and damage track of the negotiations, and 3, on adaptation.
Okay, so COP26 was actually in Glasgow last year, and nearly 200 countries made many positive commitments at that summit. So what is the status of that commitment? Particularly, has India made any progress on its commitments?
So I think for us, it's very important to distinguish political statements that leaders of the nations make standing at that forum and what is committed formally under the UN negotiations. Many countries make a lot of rhetorical speeches, statements, claims, and commitments, which really are not part of their legal obligation under the convention. If you look at those that were legally committed, I think you'll find that countries like India, China, and several other developing countries have begun to do more than their fair share of what is proportionate to the responsibility they have. Those commitments on reducing emissions are clearly a trajectory that are supposed to be of commitments to be met, say, up to 2030 and further going ahead. On those, India is pretty much on target to achieve what it's put on the board. One can always debate whether India has put enough on the board and can we commit more. But if you look at data emerging from these negotiations, the fact is that developed nations are far behind what they proportionately need to do, both on emission reductions to at what is called providing the means of implementation to the poorer countries, which again means finance, technology, capacity to adapt. And there is a clear differential that is emerging yet again between the poorer nations taking on a greater burden than the rich ones, which need to do more.
As the world plods along discussing ways of limiting climate change, it is actually running behind in schedule with early indications that climate change has already started to take effect. For example, we can say melting of glaciers, the accelerated melting of glaciers in Greenland. So, what is your thought on this?
So it's quite, I mean, if one was to go back to fundamental science of climate change, we've already committed ourselves, unfortunately, to a large number of changes that will happen to our natural systems, which is why part of the Paris Agreement and the UN Framework Convention reflects upon this bit, which is inevitable changes that are on our way. Now, regardless of how seriously we act, how fast we act to reduce our future emissions, the globe is already committed to a certain degree of change, and the poorer nations need support to adapt to that. So that becomes one element that we have to constantly address. The other bit is of making sure we don't go down further down that hellhole in some ways, and that poorer countries are provided resources not to repeat the mistakes of the richer nations. On that, I agree with you that we are slower than where we should go. And the challenge always is going to be, and it's been there for a while, that as the convention itself says, the rich nations need to lead because one, they have greater resources, they have the technologies, and they have the responsibility. Whether we wish it another way or not, the fact is poorer nations will always have to live with the fact that they have to provide for the energy need, the food security of its poor people at the moment, and whatever they can take out of this to invest in a deeper, longer future, they will. Now, the trade-offs can go up 5%, 10% more or less. One can always say India could do another 10% of renewables and think less about its immediate energy security. But by far measures and by all fair measures, I think developing countries are bearing much of the burden. So in some sense, it's a double whammy. You're bearing the burden more of climate change, and you're bearing the burden of transition even more than the rich nations while having less capacities to do so. So I agree with you that we have committed in some sense to a certain degree of changes in our lives, which will affect the poorest more. And there is not enough action on ground, even till date, to think that we are avoiding going down that route any further.
So, how can India tackle problems peculiar to our country, such as stubble burning? Should it seek international help at forums like COP27?
My sense, learning from last some years of following these negotiations, is these negotiations are not the place where any country, not just India, can think about the domestic challenges it has, which are very different for each nation. We are a partly industrialized nation with a very diverse economy than compared to another poor nation. How we allocate our priorities and tackle certain domestic issues is unique, and that we have to address as citizens within the country. While it is our right as a nation to go to these COPs and rightfully expect resources to be provided for us to do these things, the fact is that the global rich world has failed in the last 2 decades to do so. Pragmatically, I think all governments are kind of reconciled, saying that this resources for all this work will have to come from our own pockets. Now, whether we can domestically reallocate our priorities and our resources better is really up to us as citizens. I don't think COP is a venue where you can go and get this discussed fairly. So I think we have to hold our governments responsible within our nation's democratically chosen leaders to do better than they are doing so far.
Thank you for your inputs, Nithin. Viewers, please visit the Federal's YouTube page and the website for more updates and for more interesting stories. Thank you.
Subscribe to the Federal's YouTube page for more interesting updates.